Good afternoon, and welcome to our Microsoft 365 Unstructured and Structured External Sharing webinar. My name is Peter Carson. I'm going to be your host for the next hour or so. I'm the president of Extranet User Manager and also an Office Apps and Services Microsoft MVP. We always publish up the decks and the recordings from these calls, so you'll be able to get all my contact information on the event site. You should get a follow-up email within the day or so once we've got that all published up. A little background for those of you that are not familiar with Extranet User Manager, being in the external sharing space for actually over a decade, I guess, if we look back far enough through there. Evolved a lot since then, got into Microsoft 365 and B2B stuff fairly early days back, sort of 2014 for 365, 2017 for B2B. I guess it's been 4 years now. The story has certainly evolved from Microsoft, and this is a session I've delivered lots of times before, but I always try and keep it fresh and share the latest details from Redmond in terms of what's happening on the Azure AD B2B side. From a customer's point of view, work with more than 100 customers globally around the world, lots here in North America. We're based in Mississauga, just outside of Toronto, as well as Europe, Asia, and elsewhere around the world. All right, so from an agenda, what we want to cover off over the next hour or so, we've done the introductions. We're going to dive right into Azure AD external identities and give a little background and context on that. We'll take you through the out-of-the-box experiences from an unstructured sharing, whether that's through Teams, through SharePoint Online, through OneDrive, and then go into the structured sharing side. So this is kind of a phrase that we've coined to represent where sharing becomes more governed and more broad within your organization, and how do you provide some structure to that. And then we'll talk about what we're doing with our Extranet User Manager and our Extranet Documents product, specifically with Microsoft 365. We'll have the Q&A session open as we go through, so feel free to ask questions as we go through. I may or may not be able to get a chance to have a look at this as I'm speaking, but certainly at the end, or we'll follow up if we don't get a chance to address your questions through there. I would like to take a minute now and just direct folks over to the Microsoft Forums poll here. So Logan, if you want to chat that link out to the Q&A session, people can pick that up. And basically that'll take them to an anonymous Microsoft Forums poll. Quick and simple one, just trying to get a sense of, what were you looking to get out of today's session here? What things are you aware of, investigating, actively using? Sort of any challenges. We're not going to talk a lot about Azure B2C, but I will explain what it is. So should we be doing a more focused webinar on that topic? And then just from a follow-up point of view, interest in follow-up, interest in beta testing our new Extranet Documents product that I'm going to be showing shortly as well. So with that, I'm going to switch off my camera here, just so we've got a better view of the screen, and we'll dive right into things. Okay. So I mentioned B2C. So B2B and B2C mean business to business and business to consumer. And in hindsight, I think Microsoft maybe regretted those naming conventions, because it doesn't necessarily mean that. What it really means is B2B is the style of sharing that you do with Microsoft 365, Teams, your own applications, but you're connecting them in to your Azure AD, you're bringing them in as guests in your directory. Whereas B2C, originally intended more consumer facing, but really the differentiation there is it's a completely separate identity access management system for your own SaaS or custom apps that you build. It's not connected to your Azure AD. They're in a completely separate directory from that point of view. It's built for massive scale. I mean, they've got case studies of upwards of 500,000 external users on some of the tenants that are using that, but it's not intended for connecting into SharePoint Online, Teams, any of the other Microsoft 365 products. So we're going to focus primarily on the B2B side, because that's where our attention typically is. We're really thinking about how do we share our SharePoint Online sites, our OneDrive documents, things like that, with people outside of our organization as guests. So we're going to go through some slide deck here, but we're also going to flip into live demo as we go through as well. So the Azure AD external entities screen here, this is basically where you define how your external collaboration settings are going to be set up through there. So let's jump into one of my dev tenants here. So I'm in Azure Active Directory, just up at the overview level. If I come down into identity governance here, we'll see those options for configuration from that point of view. So there are things like access packages and such. Actually, you know what? I think I went into the wrong spot here. Let me go back on screen. We're going to come to this one a little bit later. Yes, it's actually the external identities, not the identity governance that I wanted to go into first. Apologies there. So basically, this is where you set up your external identities, both how are people going to authenticate into your tenant as guests, and how are you going to connect up into other systems from there. So you can actually configure Google and Facebook now. These are new features from Microsoft as external identity providers. So if you want your guests to be able to come in directly with their Gmail account or with their Facebook credentials and not have to create an account in your system, you can actually do that. Right now, we've just got Azure Active Directory, the Microsoft account. So if people have Microsoft accounts, that's supported, and the email one-time passcode that I'll talk more about. I'm actually a big fan of that one to keep it very simple from that perspective. And then a few of the other settings that we can come into here is just sort of defining tenant-wide, what are guests allowed to do, who can invite guests in. So, you know, this is an important one here. What's the access that you want to provide to guests to your directory? If you put it to the guest users have the same access as members, basically it means they can browse your directory, they can see all of your contact information for everybody in your directory. Typically, we wouldn't see that set. We wouldn't want to expose our corporate information out to our guests from that point of view. So either this limited access, or basically this one says you can see your own identity and that's it. So you can have a choice between those two more restrictive options through there. And then deciding who can bring guests in. Can it be anybody in the organization, or do you want to lock it down to specific members and users with roles, or only members in those roles, or do you just want to turn it off altogether? Maybe you're not ready for guest sharing just yet. You can say, hey, no one in the organization can invite guests in through there. Now I've left the self-service sign up turned on in here. That lights up a couple new features. This is actually a preview feature that Microsoft just launched this past spring as well. And then we can have some restrictions in there around, you know, which domains can we send invitations to. They can go to anyone. We can blacklist a list of denied domains, or we can whitelist a list of the only specified domains. So again, depending on how restrictive you want to be from that point of view. So because I've turned on this self-service lineup, this actually allows the ability for users who are not guests in your organizations to actually sign up themselves and go through that. And you can actually define custom user attributes. So if there's particular pieces of data that you want to capture as part of that registration, you can basically call it out through here. You can add additional fields, custom fields as part of that. And then you can build user flows and say, okay, what happens when somebody registers? If I come in here to a new user flow and we say, okay, in that self-registration scenario, what do we want to have happen? Well, I give a name to that particular sign-up flow. You know, which does it apply to? Is it Azure AD? Is it a Microsoft account? Or maybe I've got the Google and Facebook set up. It would be underneath those. And which are the things that I actually want to show on the form? So I can have a broader list of attributes that I'm collecting for guests, but I can say, hey, just, you know, maybe these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are the thing that we want to see in here. If I want to see all of them, I can pull that up and see that full list of attributes. So I actually build up a custom registration form fairly easily out of the box through this. And once I've done that workflow, then that's lit up and away it goes from there. And you can define further steps in there to say, hey, is there approvals on that? What happens from that point of view? So that's some background on Azure AD B2B in general. And then if we dive a little deeper in and say, okay, well, how does that fit in with Microsoft 365? I mentioned this was sort of our driving force behind choosing Azure AD B2B rather than B2C, is because it has that integration into Microsoft 365. And the key one really is this third bullet point here, which is it's completely free for certain Microsoft 365 workloads for external users. So it's not carte blanche. It doesn't mean that you can bring guests into every workload. If you've got Power Automate and Power Apps, you may have licensing implications for your external users. If you want to share Power BI dashboards, your external users either have to have their own Power BI Pro license, or you can assign one in your tenant to them. But from a SharePoint, Teams, Planner, Office Online like Word, Excel, PowerPoint, those are all freely available to as many guests as you bring in through your tenant. There's no restrictions through there. The other thing, this just changed recently, and we're going to dive deeper into it, is this monthly access user billing model. So there's certain premium features in Azure AD we'll talk about. If you want to leverage those for your guests as well, basically your first 50,000 monthly users are free for those premium features, as long as your staff are licensed for the premium features. And beyond that, it's quite cost effective as well. So, it's pretty open-ended. You can really, conceivably invite in as many external users as you'd like. Maybe not the 500,000 that some of the B2C case studies have, but certainly into the tens of thousands or potentially even hundreds of thousands of external users. So what does this experience look like? A big part of it is this idea of single sign-on, and Azure AD B2B, even though we've chosen it because we want to connect to Microsoft 365, it's by all means not restricted to that. So it's not even just for signing into Microsoft properties. So basically, Azure AD is a full, what's called an OpenID Connect identity provider. So this is a modern authentication scheme. It's what Google and Facebook and Microsoft use with their social services. And it basically allows an application to register with Azure AD and say, I'm going to use you, Azure AD, as my sign-in process, my authentication process. So basically any client app, whether it's one you build, a third-party one, a Microsoft one, and if it can federate with an OpenID Connect, you can use Azure AD for single sign-on. And likewise, OAuth 2 is sort of the underlying framework underneath OpenID Connect, but also SAML 2.0, security asset markup language, I think is what that stands for. It's another industry protocol around single sign-on, and Azure AD does support that as well. So there's a number of choices depending on how old your app is and what it needs to use from a federation point of view. And the beauty is once a user authenticates to Azure AD, they don't need to authenticate again for any other app. So let's take, for example, I've signed in my corporate portal in SharePoint Online, so I had to go through a Microsoft authentication as part of that. And maybe in my case, I'm running on an Azure AD joined device as well. So the device, it's Windows 10, is already connected to Azure AD. My browser doesn't prompt me for my corporate credentials, and I get my portal up and going from there. Now, let's say I get a link for somebody saying, hey, can you review this document or do something as a guest in our tenant? I don't need to sign in again as part of that. I don't have to re-authenticate. The single sign-on just takes me cleanly right into that. So it's a very seamless experience for the end user. Now, exactly what that experience looks like depends a bit around what type of account that user has coming in. So if they themselves are an existing Microsoft 365 user, that's kind of the most seamless experience. Basically, as I mentioned before, they log in with their Azure AD credentials and they have a seamless single sign-on experience through there. And it actually works the same if they have a personal Microsoft account and you've allowed that for federation, you can bring them in that way too. Now, this next feature, I think it actually might still be preview, or it might be at a preview now. It was actually supposed to be forced on all tenants in March of this year. Microsoft, with COVID, decided to relax some of those rules, and they pushed it back, I think, towards the end of calendar 2021. But I quite like the idea. We have it turned on in all of our tenants. The idea is if I don't have an Azure AD account, I'm not coming in with a Google or Facebook account through federation, then just send me a passcode through email. So when I go to log in and I type in my email address in the Microsoft login form, it immediately just sends me a code. I go to my inbox, grab that code, paste it into the login form, and that effectively becomes my password. It's a one-time passcode, so I can only use it once. It's only valid for 30 minutes, but it's super low friction. It's really easy. There's no password to remember. And the other thing I quite like about it, because one of the problems with external sharing in a broader sense from an extranet point of view has always been if you manage identities for your external users, you need to ensure that those people still work for those organizations. And that can become a challenge. You have to do things like re-authentication or revalidation, emails out to them to confirm they still have access to the email address. The beauty here is that kind of happens automatically. Every time you get a one-time passcode, you've effectively done a validation. If that user no longer works for that org and their mailbox is shut down, their access to your extranet is shut down as well. In fact, that applies to the first scenario as well. If I leave an organization, that organization is likely right away going to shut down my Azure AD credentials in that org. And if I need those credentials in order to get into your guest portal, then I'm shut down there as well. So from a governance point of view, it works really well from that perspective. And then the last one, the social users, this is the Google or Facebook. I suppose we should probably put the Microsoft accounts into that bucket as well. It's the same login experience. The only caveat being if you're doing the Google Federation, it doesn't understand if like a vanity corporate or business email domain is being associated with Gmail. So you don't have at Gmail, you have acme.com, for example. It won't know that that's a Google user, and the Google Federation won't work with them. But if it is a true public Gmail email address, it'll work perfectly fine. And basically the same way, if I'm already logged into Gmail or to Google, maybe I'm running Chrome and my Chrome is already signed into my Google account, I don't need to be prompted for credentials. It just goes straight in through there. And that's really the goal. You want to have that single sign-on experience across all of your environments. So how do I actually do this? Let me flip back to the Azure portal again. And I'm going to use our dev portal here. So I'm in our Envision IT Dev Azure Active Directory. It'll already come down to users here. And instead of saying new user, I say new guest user. And basically I just drop in their information, what's their email address and such, and go through that process of inviting that user in. I may want to have a personal message, assign them to some groups, set some properties on them, and then go ahead and invite them. And there's an email that comes from Microsoft that says, hey, you've just been invited, and here's a link to get in from there. You can customize that email. So if you want to put your branding in it and such, it's still going to come from Microsoft, but it'll have your corporate look and feel on that. And likewise, let's say you've got a whole bunch that you want to invite in, you can do a bulk invitation. Basically what the portal does is it provides a CSV template for you to download. You fill that in with all the users you want to invite in, including their group memberships, you upload that, and you go ahead and submit it. It's not immediate, it sort of goes into a background processing task, and you can go to the job queue and see the status on that and confirm whether all those users have been invited in successfully and what the status of that process is. Okay. So I touched on this before. They used to have what they called this 1-to-5 billing ratio, and if you wanted to use Azure AD Premium features with your guest users, you could do that. And for every internal user that you licensed, you could have the feature enabled for 5 of your guest users. So let's say you had 1,000 staff in your organization, you could have 5,000 guests using those premium features, and you wouldn't pay anything more for that. We did find some clients actually exceeded that. They were maybe a smaller organization with, say, 100 or less staff, but they had 500 or 1,000 external users. They actually had to buy additional Azure AD Premium licenses to bump it up from that 1-to-5 point of view. And what they did, I forget if it was the end of last year or the beginning of this year, they basically replaced that. And they said, you know what, we're going to make it much simpler. Your first 50,000 monthly active users are free for those P1 and P2 features. The only caveat I should add to the slide is that those staff users have to be licensed for the premium features. So you can't just have it for your guest. You have to have it for your staff. You have to pay for that. And then you can have up to 50,000 guests in. And what monthly active users means is, 1 month it might be this block of 50,000 users, and then next month, let's say 10,000 of these users are not active and a different 10,000 are, you're still in that 50,000 blocks. You're still fine from that point of view. So it's not people that are invited as guests, it's active guests that are working with you that fall under that. And if your environment is so large that you go beyond that, there's pretty nominal charges to go beyond the 50,000 monthly access. Now, this one does cause some confusion because sometimes people look at this and they think, oh, I have to pay beyond my first 50,000 guests. No, if you want to use the free features of Azure AD, you're not using the premium features, you can have as many external users as you want coming in through there. It's only if you want to use those premium features. So why would you want to do that? What are some of the things in Azure AD Plan 1 and Plan 2 that you would want to take advantage of? Some of them are still getting big, like the multi-factor authentication. MFA in general is hugely important right now. I mean, we tell every one of our clients there should be no accounts in your tenant from a member account point of view that don't have MFA turned on. Even if you've got sort of service accounts that are being used for back-end processes and things like that, you got to get rid of those. You got to have MFA 100% across the board. And conditional access, you can have MFA without paying extra for it as part of Microsoft 365, but conditional access sits on top of that unless you get more sophisticated rules. Say, hey, if you're on this device from this location doing these things, this is when I should trigger an MFA, or I'd have different rules elsewise. So for example, you don't want your staff to go through MFA every time they log in when they're on a corporate device inside your network. That's a lower risk profile. You could probably back it out. You still want to go through MFA on a new device, but maybe it's valid for 30 days. You don't have to come back and redo that. That's what conditional access is all about. Some of the other things, the hybrid identities, password protection, I mean, those are important, but they're not as relevant from an external sharing point of view. Some of the things that are, getting conditional access rules based on group, location, device. So if I'm accessing this group as an external user, maybe I have no MFA, but if I'm accessing this super secret confidential one, I do have to go through MFA. And I'm not sure if they've fixed it yet, but I know they were working on it, that you could basically rely on your guest tenant's MFA if it was there and you trusted it. So the situation they were trying to avoid is, I log into my home tenant, I have to go through MFA to successfully log in with my organizational tenant, and then I hit your tenant as a guest and you've got MFA turned on as well. I actually need to go through a second registration and a second MFA in order to do that. That's a pretty high barrier. Most extranet portals, you don't want to do that because you're just going to chase your users away. It's going to be too complicated for them. So conditional access policies come in important that maybe there's one special group that you do want to do that on. All the rest of them, it's fine not having that. And then the last piece I'm going to talk more about is Azure Information Protection. This is the ability to classify and protect documents, and that can be integrated in as part of Plan 1 as well. Plan 2 basically builds on that, and it adds in a bunch of the AI as well as workflow tools, things like identity protection, identity management. I mean, those are additional features more for your internal users, but the access reviews and entitlement management, we're going to talk more about. Those can make a lot of sense for your external users as well. But let's leave Azure Active Directory. We've gone kind of deep on the technical side over there. Let's come back to 365 and say, okay, in that unstructured scenario, what are the sorts of things that I can do? And if you've enabled it in your tenant, there's some super simple things that I can do to be able to send secure links either to sites, to libraries, to folders, to documents, and I can define what people can do with those links. Basically anybody who has that link can edit or read the content that it points to if you choose to. That scares a lot of folks. It sounds really insecure. But if you compare it to sending somebody an email attachment, for example, as soon as you attach a document to an email and send it out to folks, you've lost control over it. You have no idea who they forwarded it to, who's accessing it, what they're doing with it. Whereas when you send even an anonymous link like this, you can revoke that link if it's been shared with people you didn't want it to be shared with. It's very flexible. You can set expirations, read-only or editing. So you've got a lot more control around what people can do. You can even block download and say, you know what, I only want you to look at this content in the browser. I don't want you doing anything with it. You can't download it and send it to somebody else. Alternatively, your options are to say, hey, I want to share it with people in my organization. It's kind of like changing the permissions on it. In fact, it is under the hood, but it's creating a link that basically, like the anyone link, anybody can use, but I need to be in your organization. Or I can say, hey, there's specific people I want to share it with, or just whoever has access today. That people with existing access one is actually my favorite as the default one because it doesn't change anything from permissions. Then you have to make an active decision to say, yes, I want to do something less restrictive from that point of view. So we've got some questions that we often take clients through when they're thinking about external sharing, and not just with Microsoft 365, just from a general, members portal, external portal that you want to be building. And the first one obviously is, well, who are you going to be sharing with? And is there any sort of member database that needs to interface in? Do you use Salesforce or Dynamics 365? And maybe that needs to be part of the solution. So you'll need to decide that. Is it self-registration or is it invitation only? The simple scenarios are invitation only. Hey, I'm inviting you into this document or this site. The self-registration ones brings up things like approvals. Once somebody registers, are they just automatically in, or does somebody need to rubber stamp them and say, yep, they're good to go? And what are your external users going to be using? Is it purely Microsoft 365 Azure AD or one-time passcode from an email point of view, or do you want to support social federation like Microsoft accounts or Gmail or Facebook? What sort of interactions are they going to be doing? Is it just browser? Is it other apps and things that they're going to be connecting as part of that? And what sort of apps are they going to be going into? Is it just Microsoft 365 or other things from there? And obviously what we're discussing here right now, the context is the 365 external sharing, so that's really our focus. So once we've gone through that, we've got an understanding from a client point of view, then we say, okay, how do we want to set that up? Because there's a bunch of places I'll take you through where you need to configure the external sharing. So you got to decide, who can share, who can they share with, what are they allowed to share, how do they use those links that they get through there. These are all things that we've got fairly granular control over. So if we start at the Microsoft 365 admins, if I come to another demo tenant here, so I'm at the home of my admin center and I say, hey, I want to look at the organization-wide settings for this. It's not immediately obvious. They moved it around recently, so I was looking for it earlier today, but underneath settings and org settings is where you need to go. Once you're in there, jump over to the security and privacy. You'll see a bunch of options more for internal users like self-service password reset. It's this sharing one that you want to focus on from an external point of view. And there's not a lot of option in here. It's basically, am I allowed to invite new people or not? And we can restrict this down further, but basically this is a way to turn it off globally for your Microsoft 365 as a whole. To say, I don't want anybody adding anybody new. We have a governance process that new guest users need to go through, and we're going to use that rather than the out-of-the-box features. So, decide appropriately, but remember that it's a least privilege. So however restrictive you make it in any one of these areas that we're talking about, you're not going to be able to make it less restrictive somewhere else. It's always the most restrictive applies. And then if we go into our SharePoint Admin Center, here there's a couple of things. So we can go into the settings at the SharePoint level. Oh, that's not what I was looking for. Sorry, again, they've got a few spots here. Sorry, policies sharing. So again, this is a little more granular. Now it's applying to SharePoint rather than 365 as a whole, and you're deciding how permissive people can be in general. If you want to use those anyone links, even just in one site somewhere, you have to leave it at that anyone setting. And you can lock it down more tightly in the other sites, because you got to remember that least permissive applies from this as well. Or you can say, you know what, we're only going to share with people in our org or existing guests or new and existing guests. You can basically layer it up independently between SharePoint and OneDrive where you want that to be. Now there's additional features in here as well. You can say, hey, I want to limit by domain. This is kind of the whitelist, blacklist that I was showing in Azure AD. You've got a similar concept in SharePoint. And the thing to remember is SharePoint built a lot of this external sharing stuff independent of Azure AD B2B, and then the Azure AD team kind of caught up and built a bunch of those features in there. So you see some duplication because some of the legacy stuff is still there in SharePoint rather than drawing directly from the Azure AD side. But they're slowly knocking that off and consolidating that. You can specify, hey, which security groups the users have to be in to be able to share. This is an interesting one. You could have a group that says, I'm trained on how to do external sharing safely, and when I do that training, I get put into a group, and now I'm able to share. That's a scenario we've seen with a couple clients. I like that approach. This one, I don't even know why they don't have that checkbox there. Basically, if you uncheck that, it means that somebody can take your invitation, forward it to a different email address, accept it with that email address, and have access in based on what's been done with that invitation. I don't see the use case for that. Really, I've invited you on a particular email associated with a particular organization. Either use that one or tell me it's wrong, and we'll go through the process with the correct one. Don't let external users arbitrarily make that decision themselves. And some things around what guests are allowed to share, because if you let them, you can actually allow guests to share with other guests as part of that. When is it locked down? When do they need to re-authenticate from a verification code point of view? This one here, I'm not sure if they've combined it in with the one-time passcode. I'd like to say yes, because it makes sense if I've just used a one-time passcode, you have verified me, so you shouldn't have to take me through a separate verification process. And you can decide what the default links and such are there. Do you want it with specific people, only people in your org, anyone with the link? The one that's missing here is the people with existing access. I'll show you where to do that at the site level. default permissions? Is there expiry on them? What can they do by default? And again, you can override those as you're doing the actual sharing. So this is at the SharePoint tenant level. So we started at the Microsoft 365 tenant level, then we came down to the SharePoint tenant level. Now we're going to go down to the individual site collection level. So if I go into, say, this, I was there for a second there. I'll just research that public. This is one of the groups that I'm going to be using in a minute. So we've got this public group with approval. I go ahead and click on that group, and I come over to policies, not permissions, and go to external sharing. And this is where I can override those things. So I can say, hey, I know that the default was new and existing guests, but I want it to existing guests only. So we can make it more restrictive. We just can't make it less restrictive. I can do the same limit sharing by domain. Again, if I've blacklisted a domain at the tenant level, I'm not going to be able to enable it here. But if I've left it open and then said, hey, I only want this email domain to be able to work with this site collection, because this is a client site or a donor site or something like that that's relevant just to that organization, then you can put that limit in from that perspective. And you can either take the organizational defaults or you can override those. This is the one that I often override to say, I like this people with existing access. I wish I could set it at the org level. I can't, but I can set it at each site collection. In fact, in our team's provisioning, we recommend it getting set up that way, so it just automatically defaults that for you. Okay, so those are the levers that we have from a managing external sharing point of view. So let's switch back here. Let's actually go through a couple of scenarios. So the first one happens all the time. In fact, we had an RFP that was due, a request for proposal, yesterday at 3 p.m. So, all towards the end of last week, even over the weekend and early in the morning, we're all in there, we're co-authoring, we're working with that. And that particular proposal was actually done with a subcontractor as well, a design firm, Q30 Design, that we work with quite often from a design and accessibility and user experience point of view. So we wanted to share that proposal with them. So we can basically create a link for that, share that with them, make it editable for them, maybe set an expiration date if we want, and they can actually come in and co-author with us. And this is beautiful in either Word Online or full Word. In fact, the designers, they're working on Macs. They can use Word Online to do the co-authoring as well. We can all basically be in the document at the same time and work on different sections without stepping on each other from that point of view. So there's a number of links that we can create through that we just looked at the admin features for. Basically, whatever's been allowed to me by the administrators, I can choose those options. I can choose a more restrictive one if I want to. I can't choose a less restrictive one. And where I do this, whether it's in SharePoint Online, in OneDrive, in Teams, even in Windows Explorer, it's actually the same experience. I actually quite like Windows Explorer. So I use the OneDrive sync client to sync a whole lot of my SharePoint sites as well as my OneDrive onto my local system. And these ones are showing green dots, check marks, because they're synced to always be there. But it can be on demand so that when I access the document, it pulls it down from there. But the nice thing is, let's say I want to share this communications plan with Q30 Design, I can just right-click right in my Windows Explorer, and Windows 10 knows that this is actually a synced folder that I'm in, and it gives me the share option right here. I can come in to share, and then I decide, am I going to leave it with that default people with existing access? Well, no, the folks at Q30 don't have access to it, so I'm going to mark in specific people. We actually haven't set this site up to allow the anyone. This particular library is in our operations site. It's not really appropriate to share that with anyone. So I'm going to name those specific people, and I'll leave the allow editing in there. I go ahead and apply that, and I just bang in the names of the people that I want to send it to. And I can have it actually send the email. What I typically do is I click on the copy link here, and it will then generate a URL, and I'll put that into my own email message with some context and background of what I'm asking them to do and such as part of that. I find that flow works well from that point of view. So that was the experience in Windows Explorer. It's identical in Teams, in OneDrive, in SharePoint as well from that perspective. And that's something Microsoft's just done in the last year and a half. They've done a nice job of making that experience very consistent. The other one, we needed to collect some files actually from that same vendor for the same RFP. So, sending them a sharing link for a specific document is not going to work because we don't actually have the document. We want them to provide the document. So I find this request files feature is really handy from that point of view. So rather than saying, email me that document, particularly maybe it's a meeting recording from a 2-hour-long Teams call, it's way too big to send through email. So this request files works really well. Basically, I come to my OneDrive for Business. You can't do it against the SharePoint library, which I'm a little disappointed in. I'd like to be able to do the same feature there, but you can do it against your OneDrive for Business. So let me come over to this tenant here. If I come to my OneDrive here, so I'm in my demo tenant, I've got my OneDrive open, and I've already created a folder called request files here. I mean, naming it request files doesn't make it work. The secret sauce is I click and select. I don't click into that folder. I just click to select the folder, and we'll see this request file shows up on the toolbar. I go ahead and click that, give it a name for it. So I typically name it the same as the folder, unless it's a case study for RFP. I say next through there. And it creates this unique link. And basically anybody that has that link can upload files through there. So I typically do the same thing. I copy it, I paste it in my own email, send it off from there. And then as long as that link is valid, you can specify a period that's valid for. People can drop files in there. Now it's very much a black box. People don't get to see what's in there already. They can just drop new things in there. So you can use it to collect, RFP responses from competing vendors, and that would be fine because they wouldn't see each other's submissions through there. Only you as the owner of the OneDrive would get to see that. If I come back here, I've got that folder selected still, come over to the details pane on the top right here, and under the manage access, I can see that there is a link giving access through here. And if I want to, I can say, hey, actually want to remove that link. It was inappropriate, or I've got what I needed. I don't want to have the link there anymore. Now it's gone. And same with the idea of sending an anyone link to people. You've got that control. You can say, hey, I've put that link out there. It served its purpose. I don't want it being used by anybody anymore. Just remove it or set an expiry on it, and it's gone. Okay, so those are some scenarios from an unstructured. And you can see those, one document, couple documents, couple people, it works really well for. Now, what about when that scales out? Maybe you've got hundreds, thousands, or maybe even hundreds of thousands of external users. That process of going through manual invitations, whether it's through Azure AD or through Microsoft 365, can get pretty onerous. And as soon as it gets to that, then there's a lot of room for error. You hit the wrong people in the wrong groups, the wrong people invited and such through there. So how do you provide more structure around that? And these external users may be project members, they could be committees, customers, like there's lots of different scenarios that makes up. And who owns these groups? Are they internal business owners? They shouldn't be IT. You want the business to own and self-manage it, but they could actually be delegated to the external organization as well. So there's a number of ways that you can do this. Let's just go through the scenarios. The first, you can roll your own. You can build your own tool. You can say, hey, having people go into the Azure AD portal to invite guests is a very techie experience, and there's no way we can allow our business users to do that. You can lock it down if you want them to. I mean, you can give them what's called a guest inviter role, and that's all they can do in Azure AD, but most IT folks are pretty afraid of having their end users come into their Azure AD portal and start modifying things through there. So you probably want to have some sort of tool, similar to what we see in the portal, where I can upload an Excel, or I can do one-ofs, and you could build a Power App, you could wire it in through the Graph API and get that all working on your own. One of the other things you could do is say, well, let's use Azure Active Directory Entitlement Management, and this is the ability to create what's called access packages that define access to groups. It puts them in applications, can define access to SharePoint Online. You can have onboarding workflows around that. You can have even branding and customization. So you can target it to guests, and you can say guests are allowed to request this access package, and then the workflow will go through the approvals and onboarding, and they'll have access to the need from there. Shameless plug on our side, we also have our Extranet User Manager product. We've got a sample portal. It's very brandable, customizable, an admin portal for managing it, and some very cool web parts and such for making it easier to delegate that to your business owners through that. But let's dive a little deeper into entitlement management. So, the idea is to delegate not the creation of the package. The IT would still create the package, but then they would delegate ownership and approval of it to non-administrators, to business folks. And it removes the need for them to do anything in the Azure portal. They're just basically approving requests through that entitlement management. You can put them into security groups, give them access to SharePoint sites. You can have policies around that, who can request it, who can approve it, how long do they have access for, access reviews. That's all part of that process. Now you do need Azure AD Plan 2 in order to do this. If I come back to my dev tenant, I do have P2 set up in this tenant. So if I come back to my top level in here, and this is where I went the first time, I do want to go now, is the identity governance. So there's a number of things in here. The important ones for the external users is around the entitlement management and the access reviews. I mean, the privileged identity management, the just-in-time access, that's more of an administrator thing. I suppose you could use it if you wanted to bring guest users in for a restricted period of time. It could work well from that perspective too. But let's dive into the entitlement package side of things. Let's give that a chance to load up. So, I give it a name. I may have a catalog that I want to show it in so people can find these access packages. I define the resource rules. So this is where you assign membership in groups, you assign applications, you give access to SharePoint sites. So you set all this up. So this would typically be done by an IT administrator, and then requests would start coming in through there. And where can those requests come from? This can be used for internal onboarding and build access packages for your staff, but you can also do it for users not in your directory for a guest point of view. And you can specify which organizations it's applied to. So maybe you've got a major client where you're going to have hundreds of guests coming in to their client site in your tenant. You could build an access package specific to them that puts them in the right groups, give them access to the right SharePoint sites, and only allow those connected organizations to come in and use that package. Or you can make it wide open and let anybody come in and use that from that point of view. And what sort of request information? So this is kind of like the self-registration on Azure AD. Different context. When I'm asking for this package, what questions do we want to ask through here? Is it a short text, a multiple choice, a long text? I can define what those answers are for that. I can set up localization if you wanted in multiple languages. So it's quite sophisticated in terms of what you can capture through this process. And then the life cycle, you can actually integrate it in with access reviews to say, hey, I want regular reviews after a certain period of days. Either the package expires or maybe it can get extended as part of the access review through there. So quite sophisticated in terms of what you can build out through there. And then if we switch over onto the access review side, that can be used independent of the entitlement management as well. You can say, hey, I want to come in here and set up access reviews, and maybe I want to have a quarterly review of all guest users and ensure that they still should be coming into our portal, that they're not inactive users. And there's actually a spot in here where you can say, hey, provide some background context. Let me just apply that to guests here, but I can also have it based off of past login settings as well through there. I don't have this all set up, but let's see if we can get a little further through here. Get into the settings. Do you want to provide decision helpers, things like, hey, I want to tell them they haven't signed in the last 30 days as part of this review process. Do you want it to just get ignored if nobody takes action on it, or do you want it to remove their access? So you can specify different approaches through there. So again, quite sophisticated, and you can set up lots of rules about how you manage those external users. The last thing from Microsoft I want to talk about here is Azure Information Protection. This is probably a session on its own. There's a lot here, but basically the idea is that it can be used to classify and protect content. And what it's doing is it's applying labels. And there's sort of two main types of labels. There's retention labels and there's sensitivity labels. They both have application here. Retention labels, there's on the records management side, say, hey, after 7 years, do we need to destroy this document? Does something else need to happen from a disposition point of view? I think the more important thing from an external sharing point of view is the sensitivity labeling. Those sensitivity labels can apply very granular rights. They can say, hey, if this is a federal government of Canada protected C asset, you're not allowed to download it, you can't edit it, you can't copy it, you can just view it in the browser. That's the only thing you can do. And that can be based not just on the permissions in SharePoint, but the rights applied in Azure Rights Management based on the labels that Azure Information Protection applies. So it's a much more granular way of doing it. And there's two plans to AIP, Plan 1 and Plan 2. The big difference between them is how those labels get applied. They can be applied manually, which is what Plan 1 does, or can use content features and AI machine learning features to automatically apply labels to your content through there. And you can tie it into things like the sharing rules and the conditional access policy. So maybe if it is that protected C asset, we shouldn't allow sharing, even if the site that it's in does allow sharing. Again, least permission, this would take precedence and wouldn't allow that share to happen. Or maybe that particular asset can be shared, but we want to go through a second MFA. We don't trust the external guest multi-factor. They should go through our own MFA before they can access that sensitive document. So lots of levers and controls you can apply from that point of view. So switching gears onto the extranet user manager side, some of the things that we're doing on this side. So, the first example I want to talk about is just how we work as an organization. We heavily use both Microsoft Teams and SharePoint Online as part of our project management methodology. So what we do is we create a team in Microsoft Teams for every client, and we create channels for every project that we do for that client. Because typically have long-lived relationships with our clients. We do multiple projects over many years as part of that. So we've got a particular structure as to how we want Teams set up. We actually do all this through our open source Teams provisioning. That's a different talk, but basically, we've got the post from a channel point of view. We've got the files that links over into SharePoint. We always set up a OneNote. We prefer OneNote over Wiki, so we put that in, and we may use Planner as part of that as well. And then on the SharePoint Online site, so one of the things I should explain is we don't tend to invite our clients into the team. That becomes our internal communication process. We tend to still use email from a client point of view. We're looking forward to externally shared channels in Teams. That was supposed to be out by now. They've pushed it back to the end of this calendar year. That provides a much better experience for guests coming into Teams, because right now I find it pretty painful having to switch tenants and really losing my context when I go to a guest team. I don't like that. So our preference is keep them out of the team. We'll use that internally, but very much so bring them into SharePoint. So if I come over to, I'm actually going to use our live production tenant here. So I'm in our client template site. This is the sample one that we use to create our templates when we're provisioning new ones through there. So we've got our links to our team, our OneNote, our Planner. We have a standard shared documents library, and we also create a private documents library. And the differentiation is we've got a web part here, which is part of our extranet user manager product. It makes it very easy to say, hey, I want to invite somebody into this site, but I don't want to do it through regular permissions in SharePoint and Azure Active Directory. I want to do it very simply. Just click on an add user here, start banging in their information and invite them in, and know that there's workflow processes that grant them the right rights, which means they have read access to the site, to the shared documents. There's a particular folder in there that they can have contribute access to upload documents, and the private documents, they don't see that at all. That's really our private working area for client documents. So we've got a very scalable, easy way here that I can just start banging users in through here. And if I don't know who those people are, I can actually grab a registration link. I can take this unique URL here, copy it and paste it. It's kind of like the the link I was talking about when you're doing the N1 links to documents, but it's to the site as a whole in this context here. So you can give to your client and say, pass it around to anybody within your organization that needs access to our client portal, and then we can define whether approvals need to happen and what that workflow process looks like. It's very similar to access packages in Azure AD Plan 2. It just doesn't require you to spend the $12 a month for Azure AD Plan 2 for each of your staff users to be able to use that. So it can be a much more cost-effective feature through there. So that's sort of the first scenario there. You know, and we provide all that onboarding management, make it very simple from this point of view. Again, you know, just like Azure AD, all these emails are customizable. In fact, you can even define them to come from your email domain so they don't come from Microsoft, and have full control over that. We've got both the direct invitation and the private registration link off of the web part. Now I'm going to switch gears. This is actually a new product. You won't find it up on our website yet. We've talked about it a bit in past webinars, but we haven't actually officially launched it out just yet. We do have a couple of paying customers signed up for it, and development's going really well on it. Basically, it's a way to say, you know what, the external sharing and the SharePoint interface is great. It lets you do so much, but it's often overwhelming for users. So how do we provide a much simpler UI on top of that? So this is basically a separate website. It's built in Angular. It runs outside of SharePoint, but it's live connected to SharePoint. So it's basically providing that simple interface in. So let me just show you what that looks like here. So if I come into, this is our development, so it doesn't have too interesting of data in here, but basically the concept is in SharePoint Online, what you do is publish up one or more document sets. Document sets are basically folders with metadata. And this table up the top here is a list of those document sets that you have access to. You know, one of our clients, they represent drawing packages that need engineering review and sign off. In another, they represent financial reporting packages for subsidiaries for a publicly traded company. In another, they're safety plans for a public utility company that need to get distributed to their frontline responders, police, fire, municipal. So it can mean lots of different things, but basically, you know, you can customize the columns in here, the titles, how it all works, and say how do I want to present this out to the customer? And basically they just have a list of document sets that are shared with them. They click on one that they want to look at, and they see the documents that are in there. So if I flip to a different one here, let me go to test one, you know, that's doing a live call out to SharePoint, getting me the documents that are underneath that one. Come back to my test two, it flips back. And this part here, we're really excited about. This is basically a wizard, you know, a web content that's relative to the particular document set that you picked. And any of the metadata that's in that document set, you can expose in here, and you can format it however you want. You can make actionable links for things like approvals or for form completions. You know, so it becomes really sophisticated in terms of guiding people through that process. And then they can see the documents you shared with them. You know, they can multi-select a bunch of them. They can download them, have it zip it all up into one package for them. They can click on the links, and I'm actually taken over to SharePoint Online. So it's going through the single sign-on. It's going to the SharePoint site, but I didn't see any of the SharePoint. It just takes me right into the document itself. You know, and if I could co-author, because it was a Word document, I'd actually be able to do that through here. So very integrated in with the SharePoint experience, but very simplified from a, how do I use this? You know, even if we do things like I want to upload something in through here, you know, we can either drag and drop items into there, or I can browse to my local system, grab a document. You know, we may have some specific metadata that we want to capture, but just that one piece, we don't want to make it complicated for people. Go ahead and upload and bring it in through there. And behind all of this, there's Logic App Workflows that lets you customize how that whole process works. That's probably as deep as I have to time-wise to go into today, but we're pretty excited about this. We're looking to launch this out in the next sort of month or two with those select couple clients, and interested in chatting with others about it as well. So we talked about the download through there. Yeah, so I do want to chat a bit more about the external sharing scenarios that I breezed over. So when we were in that client template example, let me come back here for a second. You know, and I was either adding users in through here, or I was getting a registration link. That's what we call our our invitation only, or our private registration options. The invitation only, the business owner knows who they want to have in their site. They just direct invite in them, or they bulk import a set of users, and you can do that bulk import through that web part as well. Whereas private registration, you know someone who knows someone, sort of the she told two friends and she told two friends type of idea. You want to get that link out to people and let it organically spread from there. That link is not easily guessed. Somebody has to give it to you. You have to be trusted to receive it, but it can be forwarded any number of times. You might want approvals on there. Some scenarios you don't want approvals, others you absolutely do. You may even have auto approvals based on email domains to say, hey, if the person that it got forwarded to that's asked to come in belongs to the org that this site is for and their email domain matches that, just put them right in the group. Don't go through any approval as part of that. So you can get quite flexible there as well. And then the last scenario, public registration, to say, hey, anybody can discover this. We can have a link off our public website that goes into this. And again, you may or may not want approvals on that. You may want to have auto approval based on email domains, so you can bake in different rules through there. And where we expose this is in our landing application. So let me go over to show you what that looks like here. So this is basically the anonymous page. I haven't signed in at this point yet. So I can actually browse and say, hey, I want to see what public groups exist in here. So we've got a number of public groups that are available for people. Anybody can click on it. It will take them through a login process. It'll figure out whether they have an account already and they can just sign in, or whether they actually have to do a self-registration. So it becomes a very seamless experience through all of that. And over on our admin console, this is where you manage our product. You can actually define your groups. So if I come over here and say, hey, I want to search up my groups. Maybe I just want to get active groups. There's that public group no approval that we're just looking at. So everything in Extranet User Manager is in Azure Active Directory under the hood. So when we're talking about groups here, these are absolutely Azure AD security groups, but you can extend it with additional metadata. You can say, hey, do we need approval on this? Does it go to group owners, or am I going to give a list of specific emails that I want to approve this particular one? What's the group ID? So it's wired back into Azure AD. And what are all the registration options? Is it available for registration or not? Do you have to have an existing account to be able to come in and use it? If it is available, what's the link for it? Is that link publicly available? People can discover it, or it has to be sent to them. What SharePoint site is it standing in front of? Is there a SharePoint group that people should go into as part of this as well? Even what do I want to explain on the portal? What's the summary and description that I want to show on those pages before somebody signs up to explain what this group is about? So again, the idea being here, this is very easy to delegate, not like an access package in Azure AD Active Directory Plan 2, where you need an IT pro to do it. The idea is an end user, with approvals on here, could go through this process and start using this. Okay, so we're almost at the top. I'll leave these in. These are some examples of actual client sites that are using these processes. I'd like to discourage you from actually signing up and creating accounts on here if they're not relevant to you from that point of view. But you can go take a look and sort of begin the registration process and get a sense of what that looks like. Got an upcoming webinar in 2 weeks' time. We're going to go deeper on the external identities side, so deeper down into the access reviews, the self-registration features, actually show you what that looks like. We didn't have time to get all the way in from that point of view. One of the questions on the polls was, are people interested in the B2C side? We don't have as much experience there, but can certainly talk deeper on that to a certain degree as well if there's an interest there. So go ahead and respond out to that. Another plug, we're actually hiring for a content marketing specialist. So somebody's got a really strong writing, content creation, marketing bent to themselves. Please, take a look at careers in Vision IT, even if it's not for yourself. If there's somebody that has a good fit from that point of view, love to hear it from you from that perspective. And then just wrapping up on questions, I didn't actually get a chance to look as I was powering through all the content that I want to touch on. Logan, is there anything that was in there that we want to circle back on?
The one question that did come up was around the ability to assign premium licenses to different tiers of premium license. So can some users be P1 and other users be P2?
Yeah, I'm not sure on the external side because you don't actually assign those users. They're based on the monthly active users. So my sense is that it's an all or nothing. And if you had 100,000 users and you only wanted to use the Plan 2 features on 10,000 of those, the reality is that there's not a formal blocker in Azure AD. Like, it doesn't stop you from doing things. It's more of an audit point of view. So if you could reasonably defend in an audit to say we're only using Plan 2 features on the first 10,000 users, we don't need to pay the extra dollars, then I think that's quite reasonable.
Okay. The other one just came in through Leo King. Do you have any thoughts, recommendations on cloud app security brokers, for example, MCAS, when it comes to external sharing? Is it necessary, and is that something we've implemented for clients before?
Don't have experience with MCAS, so I can't speak on that one. I can do a little digging and we can follow up back and give you my thoughts. I'm always happy to do that.
Sure.
Those were the two we wanted to cover?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. Well, we are officially at the top of the hour, so I want to thank everybody for joining today and have a great rest of your day. Bye now.